The nurse had a warm way of moving through a room, the kind that made you feel like everything she touched would hold. She stepped into the recovery bay at just past 2 in the morning, checked the monitors with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd read 1,000 of them, then turned and noticed the man sitting in the chair beside the bed. He was still in his work jacket. There was a grease smear along his left forearm that he hadn't noticed, and his boots had tracked a thin line of slush across the floor from the door. "She's lucky to have you," the nurse. "Her name tag," Sandra said softly. "A lot of people would have gone home hours ago. Your wife is going to be okay." Kieran Boyle went very still. He was not her husband. He had not known this woman's name until he read it off the intake form at the admissions desk. He was an electrician from Hamilton who had been called out at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night to fix the backup power system on the 3rd floor of St. Michael's Hospital, and he had been on his way to the parking garage for his truck when he'd found her. He opened his mouth. The woman in the bed, Audrey, the form had said. Audrey Lane reached over and closed her fingers around his wrist. Her grip was steady and deliberate, the grip of someone who had made a considered decision. "I know," she said, her voice roughened by smoke inhalation but entirely clear. She was looking at Sandra, not at Kieran. "That's why I'm not letting go of him." Sandra smiled. She noted something in the chart and moved on. Kieran waited until the door finished closing. Then he looked at Audrey Lane. She was not confused. She was not in shock. She had known exactly what she was saying, and whatever the reason was, someone had already tried to kill her once tonight, so he decided to hear her out before he corrected anything. He had been in the trades for 17 years. His father had been an electrician. His uncle had been an electrician. He'd grown up understanding that the way a building's power moved through it told you things. Not just technical things, but things about the people who'd built it, the corners they'd cut, the decisions they'd made at 2 in the morning when no one was watching. He had a talent for listening to systems and hearing what was wrong beneath the surface, and it had made him one of the most sought-after master electricians in the Greater Toronto area. His son Leo had started leaving notes on his lunchbox. Not every day, just the days when he woke up early and decided, in the way 9-year-olds decided things, that the note needed to happen. They weren't long. Usually just a drawing of something he'd seen. A bird, a crane at a construction site, a dog that had followed him to school once. Kieran kept every one of them in the inside pocket of his work jacket, tucked there each morning before he left. His wife, Colleen, had been dead for 3 years. She had died in the spring, quietly, in a way that the attending physician called a medication complication. A sudden arrhythmia traced to a dosing error during the clinical trial she'd enrolled in for her autoimmune condition. The trial was administered by a company called PharmaVantage. The official finding was adverse event unforeseeable. Kieran had read it 4 times and not believed a word. Before she died, Colleen had told him something was wrong, that she'd felt the medication shift. Not in the way symptoms shifted, but the way a sound shifted when something in a system changed. She was a careful woman. She'd written it down. He still had the notebook. He hadn't done anything with the grief except work. He worked, and he took Leo to school, and he went to parent-teacher interviews, and he made dinner 4 nights out of 7, and on the nights he couldn't, his mother came over. And in the back of his truck, underneath a plastic case of tools he rarely opened, he kept a printed archive of every clinical trial document he'd been able to access through Freedom of Information requests, medical databases, and one very patient contact at a downtown law firm who'd never charged him for anything. He hadn't figured out what to do with any of it. He was still trying to figure it out when he found Audrey Lane face down on the concrete of level P1 of the hospital's parkade, 30 meters from a car that had come to rest against a support column with its front end crumpled and steam rising from the hood. The driver's door had been fused shut by the impact. He'd used the emergency tool on his keychain, the one he'd carried since his apprenticeship, the one every electrician in his family carried, to break the window and pull her clear. She was conscious by the time he had her on the ground, both hands braced against his shoulders, saying something he couldn't hear clearly over the alarm sounding from the car. He didn't leave when the paramedics arrived. He told himself it was because he needed to give a statement. He gave the statement and then he waited, because the admissions desk said she'd come in alone and her emergency contact wasn't picking up. He waited through bad coffee and fluorescent lighting and, somewhere around the 3rd hour, stopped pretending he had a practical reason. At 2 in the morning, Sandra came out to tell him the patient was asking for him by description. the man in the work jacket who'd stayed. He went in. She told him her name as though he might already recognize it. He didn't. She told him she was a judge, an Ontario Superior Court judge, who 3 days earlier had issued a ruling in a class action against PharmaVantage, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies operating in the country. The ruling had been unfavorable to the company in the extreme. The damages awarded were significant enough to be described in the Globe and Mail that morning as the largest pharmaceutical liability judgment in Canadian history. She told him her cousin, Garrett Hume, was PharmaVantage's vice president of clinical operations. She told him Garrett had called her 4 times in the week before the ruling asking her to recuse herself. She had declined. She told him she had received 3 days ago a USB drive from a whistleblower inside PharmaVantage's research division, a man named Alistair Webb, who had been quietly building a file for 2 years. The drive contained internal clinical trial documentation that had not been disclosed to plaintiff's counsel. She had been transporting it to a colleague's office when her car lost steering on the Gardiner Expressway. The drive was in her coat pocket when he pulled her out. It was still there. "They serviced my vehicle at the company's preferred automotive center," she said. "Garrett arranged it. Said it was a courtesy." Her voice was still rough, but her eyes were entirely clear. It wasn't a courtesy. Kieran sat back. "I have a 9-year-old son," he said. "He's with my mother tonight, but I can't be whoever you need for this. I'm not asking you to be anything yet." He stood up. He was in the process of putting his jacket on when they both heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the soft, irregular sound of hospital staff, but the measured, deliberate rhythm of people who knew where they were going and wanted to arrive there without drawing attention. He looked through the narrow glass panel in the door. 2 men in security uniforms. He looked at their lanyards. He looked at their faces. The photographs were wrong, not subtly wrong, categorically wrong, the way a forged document looked if you knew what genuine looked like. He locked the door and called the nurse's station from the room phone. By the time hospital security responded, the corridor was empty. Audrey looked at him from the bed with an expression that communicated everything it needed to. "They know I have it," she said. By morning, Kieran had been awake for 21 hours. He was still in the chair beside Audrey's bed when Sandra came in for her morning round, and it was then, in the warmth of that misidentification, "Your wife is going to be okay," that Audrey made the decision she made. She explained it after Sandra left. Whoever had sent those 2 men was monitoring the hospital. Anyone arriving who looked like a lawyer, an investigator, a colleague with authority would be watched. A husband who'd sat up all night would not. She needed 48 hours. She needed to move the USB drive safely and get Alistair Webb's documentation to the right authorities without interception. She could not do it as a judge alone in a hospital room. She needed someone who wouldn't draw attention. "I'll pay you," she said. Kieran looked at her for a moment. "Don't." The temperature in the room shifted. Audrey was quiet. Then she said, "I don't know how to ask for help without attaching a transaction to it. It's been a long time since I tried the other way." She said it without self-pity. 3 conditions. Leo stayed out of it entirely, his name, his school, his grandmother's address, completely separate from everything. Audrey told him the truth about every risk, and when they had enough to hand over, it went to the RCMP, no hesitation, no delay. She agreed to all 3 without negotiating. Garrett Hume arrived at noon with a junior lawyer and a communications manager. He was pressed and unhurried, the kind of man who understood that the appearance of composure was its own form of control. He stood in the doorway and looked at Kieran with the measured neutrality of someone assessing a variable they hadn't factored into their model. Audrey introduced him. "This is Kieran, my husband." Kieran did not look away from Garrett. Garrett's neutrality flickered, just once. Then the composure reasserted itself, and he said something gracious and meaningless about being glad she was in good hands, and he left. Kieran understood in the moment after that the role he'd agreed to play had become something structural. He was now the person standing closest to Audrey Lane, which meant he was the primary obstruction between Garrett Hume and what Garrett still needed. He also understood, with a clarity that surprised him with its steadiness, that he wasn't going to move. They moved to a hotel on King Street that evening. Audrey opened the USB drive on her laptop. Kieran sat across from her and read what it contained. He read it for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he said her name. Not because he had something precise to say, but because he had found something, and he didn't know how to absorb it alone. The trial files on the drive were organized by cohort, groups of patients enrolled in PharmaVantage's long-term Phase 3 trials going back a decade. There were incident reports, there were internal memos, there were emails from Garrett's office to the research division asking that certain adverse events be reclassified before they reached the External Safety Monitoring Board. Kieran Boyle's name was in Cohort 7. He had not known she was enrolled in a PharmaVantage trial. She had told him only the name of the clinic, and he had never connected it to the company. She was listed in the file not as a fatality but as a study discontinuation, adverse event, unforeseeable, exactly the language that had appeared in her official record. Beside her name was a notation in Garrett's own correspondence, dosing adjustment applied remotely. Event occurred within expected window, no further action required. Kieran sat with that for a very long time. Audrey didn't speak. She waited. There are moments when the most generous thing you can give someone is the space to sit with what they've just learned, and she was precise enough to recognize this as one of them. When he finally spoke, he told her about the notebook, about Colleen's last weeks, the way she'd described feeling the medication change before the arrhythmia, the way she'd written it down because she believed it mattered to have a record. He told her about the Freedom of Information requests, the law firm contact, the archive in the back of his truck, that he hadn't known what to do with because he hadn't proof, only a shape. He told her about Leo, about the lunchbox notes, about the way Leo still set two places at the kitchen table sometimes without realizing he was doing it. Audrey listened to all of it. Then she said, "The person who altered that dosage is responsible for what happened to Colleen, not the husband who was working and trusting the system to do what it promised." She paused. "You didn't fail her. The system failed her. There's a difference, and I need you to know I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's a factual distinction and it matters." It was not a grand statement. It did not fix the 3 years. But something in the way she said it, flatly, precisely, as though correcting an error in a record, reached a part of him that hadn't been reached before. He breathed out slowly. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Alistair Webb contacted them through a secure channel at 11:30 that night. He had more documentation, physical files kept off-site, encrypted backups stored with a former colleague at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicines. He needed them to receive the transfer in person. He suggested a meeting at the Law Faculty Building on Queen's Park Crescent the following evening, after hours. There was no clean way to enter the building, as anything other than what they were supposed to be. They arrived as a couple who belonged there. Her arm through his, unhurried, a woman who had spent 20 years moving through institutional spaces under observation, and a man who moved the way he always moved, directly and without performance. The power in the building went out when they were 40 meters from Alistair's office. Not a fuse, every floor, every corridor, all at once. Kieran recognized the signature immediately. He had seen deliberate outages before, the specific quality of a complete drawdown versus a tripped breaker. This was deliberate. Someone had accessed the building's external junction. He pulled Audrey behind a stairwell column before he finished processing the thought. He could hear movement, 2 sets of footsteps, coordinated, working from the far end of the corridor toward them. He dealt with the first one in the space between the column and the fire door. It wasn't clean. It cost him something. But it gave him the man's phone, and on the screen was a message from an unlisted number. "Retrieve the drive. Find the boy if necessary. The husband is the problem." Kieran read it once, then again. He was not her husband. He had been functioning in the role for 30 hours and had agreed to it for 48. But whoever was sending those instructions believed he was the person Audrey trusted most, which made him the most direct threat to Garrett's timeline. The role he'd agreed to play had become the reason someone was looking for his son. He called his mother. He didn't say much. He gave her the address of his cousin in Barrie and told her to take Leo there tonight and to leave her own phone at home. His mother asked one question, "Kieran, are you safe?" He said yes. She said okay and hung up. Alistair had seen the blackout and pulled back. He sent a text 2 minutes later. Files intact, he would find another way. He did. He had duplicates with 2 professors who had been waiting for exactly this kind of call for longer than Alistair had been collecting documents. Kieran and Audrey waited in a utility room off the back stairwell until the building was clear. She stopped performing composure after that. They sat on the floor with the door locked, listening, and the professional architecture she'd been maintaining since the hospital simply wasn't there anymore. She was just a person sitting on a cold floor in the middle of the night, tired in a way that went past physical. She told him about Garrett, how he had been the one constant after her parents died. Her father first, her mother 8 months later. How she had believed it was loyalty. How the distance between the man she'd known and the one who had arranged to have her driven off the Gardiner Expressways was a distance she was still working out how to cross. "It's not just the betrayal," she said. "It's that I thought I still had one person left." Kieran thought about the archive in the back of his truck, about the 3 years of asking questions no one would answer. He thought about what it meant to discover that the thing you'd been building in isolation had always been connected to something much larger, and that the person sitting on the floor across from you had been inside it too, from a completely different direction. "You had more than one person," he said. "You just didn't know which one yet." Garrett filed an emergency motion in divisional court the following morning. He framed it as a welfare concern. Audrey's accident, her physical condition, the sudden appearance of an unidentified man claiming to be her husband. If the motion succeeded, it would trigger an interim review of her authority and push Guardian X through approval under interim leadership that Garrett controlled. Audrey told Kieran she was going to contest it in person. His phone rang before she could finish. Leo's voice was the most ordinary sound he'd heard in 2 days. He wasn't calling about anything urgent. He said, "Dad, Grandma says we might stay at Uncle Pete's for a bit. Can we have poutine when you get back?" That was the whole question. And something in Kieran's chest, which had been sealed for 3 years, opened, because Leo had asked him some version of that question every night since Colleen died. Not because he needed to know the menu, because he needed to know his father was coming home. Kieran told him yes. He told him to eat without waiting. He said he loved him, and Leo said, "I know, Dad," the way he always did, and the call ended. Kieran called his mother back, confirmed Pete's address, and told her 2 more days. He went back to find Audrey. She was standing by the window with her coat already on. Before he could say anything, she said, "I'm not going to let Leo lose another parent, so tell me what we do." He reached for his jacket. As he pushed his arm through the sleeve, his hand caught something in the inside pocket. A folded piece of paper, pressed flat against the lining with the particular care that only one person in his life applied to things done quietly, without announcement. He pulled it out. It was a drawing. Leo had drawn their street, the narrow one in Hamilton, with the maple tree out front that needed trimming, the exact slope of the front steps, the number above the door. In the doorway, 2 figures, one tall, one smaller. The taller one had something in his hand that was meant, Kieran realized after a moment, to be a toolbox. Below the drawing in Leo's handwriting, "Come home, Dad. I saved you the left side of the couch." Kieran stood in the hotel room and looked at it for a long moment. He folded it back along its crease and put it in his shirt pocket, closer in. "Let's go," he said. The divisional court review was heard in chambers with a duty judge, a court officer, and the relevant counsel. Garrett was present with 3 lawyers. He had prepared thoroughly. Kieran set Alistair's documentation on the table and explained what it contained. He used precise language and did not raise his voice. He described what the clinical trial records showed, the reclassification of adverse events, the remote dosing adjustments, the internal correspondence routing through Garrett's office, the gap between what had been disclosed to plaintiff's counsel and what PharmaVantage had actually known. He pulled up his own archive on a borrowed laptop. 17 years of Freedom of Information requests, the reconstructed fragments from Colleen's file, every data point he'd been able to gather. He set it beside the records on Alistair's drive. The entries matched at the root level. Alistair arrived 20 minutes in with a letter from 2 faculty members at U of T's Faculty of Medicine confirming the chain of custody for duplicate files. The duty judge reviewed the material. She made a phone call. She made another. Garrett said the documents were fabricated. He said the man beside Audrey had a personal grievance against PharmaVantage. He said this with the composed authority of someone who had prepared for exactly this contingency and found it insufficient. The RCMP arrived before he finished his 3rd sentence. The formal process took months. Kieran Boyle's file was among the first reopened. Kieran received the notification by email on a Tuesday morning while Leo was at school, which was not the right medium for what it contained, but there was no right medium for something like that. The amended finding was 4 sentences. The adverse event had been caused by unauthorized remote modification of medication dispensation records. The patient had not been negligent. The patient had not been at fault in any respect. The company had known within 72 hours of her death that the system modification had occurred. He read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer, where he kept the notebook. Audrey gave a public statement that did not minimize the court's failure to identify the non-disclosure earlier, and did not frame PharmaVantage's conduct as the work of one man alone. She said the structure had permitted it. The deference given to corporate assurances, the gaps in audit protocol, the way institutional trust had become a mechanism for institutional concealment. She said correcting it was not a communication exercise. She established an independent research ethics oversight body with an external board, no pharmaceutical representation, and full suspension authority over any trial that failed to meet its standards. When a reporter asked about the electrician, the husband who had turned out not to be a husband, Audrey answered without hesitation. She said he wasn't her husband. She said he was the man who had pulled her out of a crumpled car in a hospital parkade at 9:30 on a Wednesday night before he knew her name, who had stayed through the night because no one else had, who had read a document that contained his late wife's name and kept going, because stopping would have meant the people responsible for both of their losses would walk away clean. She said there was no version of justice that didn't include his name on it. Kieran went back to work. He dropped Leo at school on a Monday morning and listened to him talk the whole drive about a circuit board he was building in class. He'd decided he wanted to understand what his father did. Kieran drove to a job in the East End after drop-off, a commercial building with a panel that had been throwing intermittent faults for 3 weeks. He was in the middle of tracing the fault when Audrey walked into the building at 11 o'clock, with a folder under her arm, and the same directness she brought to everything. She set the folder on the breaker panel beside his tools. Inside was the amended incident report for Colleen's file and a handwritten letter, 3 pages on plain paper written by hand, the handwriting of a woman who composed her thoughts precisely before she committed them to the page. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," she said. "I just needed you to have the paper version." Kieran set down his tester. He told her about the moment in the utility room, when he'd read the message on the attacker's phone and understood that the role he'd taken on had made him a target and that someone was looking for Leo. He told her that in the middle of all of it, he'd had a thought that had nothing to do with any of it. He'd thought about the fact that he hadn't said something to her, that if things went badly, he wouldn't get the chance to say it. He told her he had stayed through all of it, not for the evidence, not entirely for Colleen, though he'd needed that too, but because somewhere in 48 hours he had stopped thinking of her as the person he was helping and started thinking of her as the person he didn't want to lose. He hadn't felt that way about anything in a long time. He didn't fully know what to do with it, but he wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there. He said it the same way he said everything. Measured, no ornamentation, straight from the surface of what was true. Audrey was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Yes." "Do you want to try anyway?" He looked at her. "That's why I'm still standing here," he said. 3 months later, Audrey established the Kieran Boyle Research Ethics Center, independent of any pharmaceutical affiliation, external board, full suspension authority over any clinical trial operating in Canada that received public funding. She asked Kieran to hold that authority on behalf of the 19 families identified in Alistair's documentation. He accepted on one condition: the building would carry all 19 names, not in a footnote, on the entrance wall in permanent letters at eye level. She agreed without negotiating. Leo took his time. He was not a child who was managed or hurried. He watched Audrey for weeks, when she came to the house, when she ate dinner at the table, when she helped him understand a part of his circuit board project that he'd gotten stuck on. He observed her the way his father observed wiring, looking for where the current actually ran, not where the diagram said it should. One afternoon, he went to the shelf in the hallway and brought down the photograph of Colleen that his grandmother had framed. He held it out to Audrey. "She was really funny," he said. "Dad says she could make anyone laugh even when she was mad." Audrey looked at the photograph for a long moment. "You can see it in her eyes," she said. "She's already thinking of the punchline." Leo looked at the photo. Then he set it back on the shelf and went to get his shoes because they were supposed to be going to the hardware store and he'd been waiting to pick out wire gauges for his circuit board for 2 weeks. He didn't say anything more about it, but after that afternoon he started leaving notes in Audrey's jacket pocket the same way he left them in his father's. Small drawings, a bird, a crane, the maple tree out front. She kept everyone. The follow-up appointment was 5 weeks after discharge. Sandra was on the same floor, same shift, and she recognized them both before they'd made it to the desk. "Well," she said, with the warmth of someone who believed she had been present at the beginning of something, "what do I call him today? The man who sat up all night, or the world's most patient husband?" Kieran opened his mouth. Audrey looked at him, a direct, unhurried look, the kind she used when she meant exactly what she was about to say. "Not my husband yet," she said. "But he's the man I'm in love with, and the only person I want to build something with." Kieran didn't speak. After a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a key. A house key, brass, worn smooth at the edges, the spare he'd cut for the back door of his house in Hamilton 3 years ago and never given to anyone because there had been no one to give it to. He set it on the admissions desk in front of her. "No arrangement," he said. "No conditions, just a door that's been waiting for someone to decide what it's for." Audrey picked it up. She turned it over once in her palm. Then she took his hand firmly, deliberately, with full intention, and this time there was no nurse to perform it for, no risk to manage, no cover to maintain. Just the two of them in a hospital corridor on an ordinary morning, holding on. The misidentification that had started everything, "Your wife is going to be okay," had turned out to be the only true thing said in that room. It had simply arrived ahead of schedule. If you believe that ordinary people doing the right thing still matters, this channel, Echoes of Memory, is built around that belief. Stories like this one, every single week. Subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.